Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 19. Will lay where he landed for a long time, taking stock of himself, his head flaring with pain where he'd struck it. He groaned, the ache in his skull sharpening, wincing as the impact made itself known all over his body. "Mr. Graham! Mr. Graham!"
"Will! Oh my goodness, Will!"
The voices of Mr. Hawks and Mina reached him through the thundering in his ears, and Will opened his eyes, finding the butler, the housekeeper, Jimmy, and Mina looming over him by lamplight in an attempt to help. "What on earth happened?" Jimmy gasped, helping him sit up. "We heard you all the way upstairs."
"Will, are you hurt, dearest? Oh my gods!"
Mina fretted, pale and frightened, her fingers fluttering over him like butterflies, uncertain where to land or what might hurt him. "There was something on the landing," Will said, biting his lips slightly in discomfort as her questing fingers skimmed over his ribcage, waking a flaring ache that stole his breath. I tripped over it. I was just clumsy." Mrs. Henderson rushed up to check, and Will could hear the sudden low drone of Hannibal's voice when he spoke to her, a soft purr accompanied by the growing strength of his scent as he was finally drawn by the ruckus. Will tried to recall if he'd caught Hannibal's scent in the hallway, but it permeated everything to varying degrees, and he couldn't be sure if he had or hadn't. The hands that had pushed him too, he couldn't quite recall being large or small. It had happened so quickly. Hannibal's suite was right next to his, yet the servants in the attic had heard the commotion and responded before Hannibal had. Will stared at Hannibal and wondered with cold dread if his husband had found an opportunity yet again to deal with him as he had his first wife. "Will?" Hannibal called, standing at the top of the stairs in his dressing gown and nightshirt, hair mussed from sleep. He started down and Will tensed, earning himself a sharp, suspicious glance from Jimmy. "What on earth has happened?"
"He nearly broke his neck," Mina said, concern sharpening her voice to a nice edge. She turned on Hannibal, half blocking Will behind her as if to protect him. "I was clumsy," Will said, recalling the feel of quick hands pushing him. "I fell."
"Fell? Down the stairs?"
Hannibal asked, incredulous, bewildered by the whole episode, and especially bewildered by Lady Rathmore's trembling outrage. Will stared up at him, as if he was a deranged stranger, and Hannibal could only look back at him in confusion, his concern doubling by the sight of the lump rising on his pale forehead.
"He is shaken up, my lord,"
Mr. Hawks said, straightening and attempting to diffuse the tension when Will refused to answer for himself.
"He woke half the house! How could you have slept through it?"
Mina demanded, nostrils flaring and mouth taut.
"He might have died, Lord Clarges, little though you would care."
"Mina!" Will sharply said, and winced with pain as Jimmy helped him to his feet, supporting him under his arm.
"Lady Rathmore, I am not in the mood to have a guest in this household shrieking at me in her night clothes," Hannibal said, the set-down coming out more sharply than he intended due to his concern, but at least hushing her wild accusations. "I will attribute that comment to an excess of nerves and forgive it."
"Come along, Mr. Graham, let's get you back to bed, shall we?"
"Let me examine him,"
Hannibal said, true worry gnawing at him. The scent of Will's fear agitated him. The sensation of it in his gut and chest woke a primal desire to comfort him. He wanted nothing more than to pluck the slender Omega from Jimmy's grasp and carry him off someplace safely within reach. Will's fear spiked palpably when Hannibal reached for him, and Hannibal immediately dropped his hand, alarmed by it. Will's voice was thin and cold when he said, "No, thank you, Lord Clarges. I assure you I am fine."
"Will, you've just fallen down the stairs. You might have broken something,"
Hannibal said, his mate's resistance only making him more worried. This was not the first time Will had behaved and responded as if he was afraid, but never to this level of absolute horror, and he could only put it down to what had just happened.
"I understand your fall has frightened you, but you might truly be badly hurt. Please allow me to examine you before you try and take the stairs, or else let me carry you up. You might have broken a bone, for God's sakes, or the very least hit your head."
"Leave him alone!"
Mina said, nearly a shout, her fear more obvious than Will's, but no greater. "Jimmy can see to me," Will said, moving away when Hannibal stirred closer in response to his upset. "Do not touch me." Jimmy waited, looking anxiously from Will to Hannibal, until Hannibal finally gave him a short, sharp nod, settling for saying,
"Check him thoroughly, Jimmy. If anything is broken, get me at once."
It was immensely disturbing to see Jimmy and Mina helping Will up the stairs, knowing that he was hurting. It was even more disturbing to think that Will was quite tangibly frightened of him for no reason he could discern, and his mind could only find one answer as to why. Duxbury. Melinda. The shadow of his first wife, and the circumstances of her death that Hannibal, even in the face of Will's distrust and fear, found himself at a loss or opportunity to explain. "Milord?" Mrs. Henderson hurried his way, her white nightgown billowing around her slim ankles. "There's nothing there, milord," she whispered, casting a worried glance at Will as he hit the landing with Jimmy's help, Mina lingering behind to glare daggers down at Hannibal before flouncing off in a huff. "Nothing at all."
"He tripped over nothing, and nearly killed himself rolling down the stairs?" Hannibal queried, worry gnawing at him. "He's never once been clumsy." "He seemed very frightened, my lord," Mr. Hawke said, shielding his bare lamp from the breeze of their movements. "It is possible he tripped in the darkness. What on earth was he about this time of night?" Hannibal asked, deeply unsettled. He'd felt such a gut-wrenching stab of worry when he'd heard the commotion and seen Will mounted at the foot of the staircase like a discarded rag doll, that it still twinged in his stomach, sour and heavy. Thank the gods the noise had finally penetrated his heavy sleep, else he would have no knowledge of the event at all. "Perhaps that is a question best asked come breakfast, my lord," Mr. Hawke said, delicately pointing out that it was late and no time for harsh feelings. "Of course, yes. Back to bed with you both," Hannibal said, waving them off toward the servants' stairs as he slowly made his way back to his suite. He lingered at the top of the stairs, searching the black-on-black darkness for any sign of what could have tripped Will into his fall, but there was nothing that he could see. Clumsy, he'd said, and the air still smelled of his fear. It brought a rough, involuntary chuff from him, tugging him again to check on Will and ensure he was calm now, no longer so frightened or threatened. "It is natural," Bedelia had said, firm in her instruction of him in all sorts of surprising things. He wanted to go to him, to see if he could ease him as Bedelia had insisted was possible, to try establishing a connection that could soothe the fear Hannibal all but tasted on him. He was not, however, such a cad that he could not recognize what Will would make of it, namely, that he was taking advantage of his vulnerability. Unwilling to risk engendering any of Will's righteous violence, Hannibal returned to his suite instead, knowing he would be awake, sleepless in his bed, until the wee hours of the morning, wondering how on earth he was to manage to get closer to his mate when Will was so strangely, terribly frightened of him. The aftershock of his fall left Will trembling as Jimmy and Mina eased him down onto his bed. The world seemed to sway sickeningly in one direction, then the other, and he winced from the lamps Jimmy began to light, every bone in his body protesting with each breath he took. "Oh, my darling," Mina whispered, sitting next to him to gently tease his hair from a place that throbbed in time with his heartbeat. She grimaced as she did so, breathing. "A goose egg already, and you bloodied it. Will, what happened?" "Nothing," Will said, knowing she could feel his agitation as keenly as her own. When Jimmy vanished into the washroom to gather supplies, he quickly whispered, "I was pushed, Mina." "Pushed? But dearest, you must—" She cut off, casting a nervous glance at the doorway when Jimmy passed across to reach the cabinet. Lowering her voice to a bare purr, she said, "Will, you must tell someone." Will shook his head just slightly, cringing against renewed discomfort. Swallowing hard against growing nausea, he managed, "No, Mina, please, say nothing." Jimmy returned and carefully cleaned up the few places on Will's scalp still oozing blood, wincing as he did so. "Well, no stitches required," he said, carefully dabbing some ointment on the open places. "So far so good, but no promises for tomorrow. Does anything feel really wrong? I'm no doctor, Mr. Graham, so I apologize for my ineptitude on this count." "It's fine, Jimmy, you needn't examine me," Will breathed. "Hannibal was merely posturing before the servants." Jimmy frowned, his weighty gaze on Will for a long moment before he said, "You really should have let Lord Clarges have a look." "How can you say such a thing?" Mina asked, aghast, and nervously averted her gaze from Jimmy's questioning glance. Will said nothing.
Through the crashing pain in his head, he kept feeling hands pushing him, just like in his dream. And he'd fallen, hadn't he? Fallen and been hurt, and the one who was supposed to protect him, to care for him, was in all likelihood the one who had pushed him. "Mr. Graham," Jimmy said, finishing up and mixing some headache powder into a glass of water for him. "Did something else happen?" Mina tensed beside him, trembling to burst into an admission, but wisely holding her tongue. Will shook his head, and immediately regretted it when his skull felt fit to fracture. Closing his eyes to allay his nausea, he whispered, "No, Jimmy, I fell." Jimmy sighed, pressing the glass into his hand. "You can tell me, Mr. Graham," he insisted. "If you're frightened of Lord Clarges, I'll make sure the Duke is made aware—" "No," Will said sharply, fingers clenching on the glass. Softening his tone slightly, he said, "No, it isn't that. I just fell, Jimmy, that's all." The press of his mouth betrayed the fact that Jimmy knew he was lying, and didn't like it one bit. But he patted Will's knee all the same and told him, "Well, drink that right up. It will help with the pain. Leave the glass on the nightstand, Mr. Graham. I'll get it come morning." "Thank you, Jimmy," Will said, barely more than a whisper.
"Goodness, the servants here are so familiar with their betters,"
Mina said, glowering at Jimmy, who, surprisingly, glowered right back. Wordlessly, he put out the other lights and quietly closed the door behind him, leaving Will alone with Mina. "We should write father," Mina said the moment the door was closed, turning to take Will's hands in hers. "No, Mina."
"But Will, we must do something,"
she said, and cupped his cheek, her mirroring blue eyes searching his own.
"What comes next, Will he come through that door and throttle you and allow everyone to think it was your fall that did it?"
Will dropped his head, wishing it didn't make so much sense, the pull on the muscles in his neck making him grimace. His twin, however, had her own measure of his strange intuition, and knew precisely where his fears lay.
"I will stay here with you."
"No, Mina, please," Will said, squeezing her hand. "He failed once tonight. He will hardly try again. Please don't trouble yourself. Go back to bed and get some sleep."
"How on earth can I, knowing what I know?"
she hissed, glancing at the washroom door as if Hannibal might burst through and murder them both. "Mina," Will said, taking a deep breath. "Please, I just want to get rid of this terrible headache. I will not be done to death in my bed, I swear it."
"You never imagined you would be done to death on your own stairs, either,"
she flared, but after a long silence finally pressed a kiss to his unhurt temple and said,
"Very well. I'll turn out these lamps, dearest. Try to get some sleep."
She rose gracefully and put out the remaining lamps, finding her way to the door in the faint moonlight. She paused there before leaving and told him,
"I am only just beside you, Will. If you need me, call out."
Will waited for the quiet click of the door and eased himself back into bed. He tried to go back to sleep, but found that he couldn't. Even after drinking the drugged water down, he lay awake wondering who that person was he'd seen fleeing downstairs. He could easily imagine it was the widow Reynolds, attempting to skulk from the house, her purpose accomplished. He wondered if Hannibal had seen his opportunity and taken it, one forceful shove to end Will's life and grant freedom to Hannibal's own. It would not, according to Molly and Mina, and the world at large, be the first time he would have done such, Will knew. It chilled him to the depths of his soul and left him nervous and out of sorts. He abandoned all pretense of sleep and finally rose to dress with excruciating slowness, using only the bedside lamp so as not to call attention to himself. The servants would be up if they knew he was, and he had no desire to bother them. He took his small, mostly shuttered lamp to light his way, and crept out onto the landing again. It took him some pacing, but he found the creaky board that had alerted him to a presence. It was between his door and Hannibal's, not beyond. Whoever it had been, they had come from the direction of Hannibal's suite, or else further down the hall. Will's heart skipped, the beat of it echoing in his head, and he tamped his fear down firmly. It was an old acquaintance, after all, following him here from the house of his father, and dodging his steps every day since his saddle had been cut. He would not allow himself to be controlled by it, nor dissuaded by his instincts, which pushed him to seek safety with Hannibal. Squaring his shoulders, and fighting the pain that threatened to break his skull, he went to the stairs, recalling his angle. Whoever had pushed him had come from the deeper darkness behind him. Unless 2 strangers had somehow broken into Hertford House in a bizarre attempt to harm him, it was very likely that the person who had pushed him was Hannibal himself. Will's breath left him on a shaky exhale, and he took the stairs cautiously, clinging to the railing. It felt as if every joint in his body had been jostled loose, aching from the top of his head all the way to his knees, throbbing in time with his heartbeat. He couldn't allow it to deter him, however. He resolutely caught his breath at the foot of the stairs and took stock, determined to figure out at least part of this issue. The other person had fled somewhere when he'd called out to them. The stairs fed onto the main doors, the most likely escape. Will rallied himself and checked the locks by lamplight. They were undone, the latches opened from the inside. Whoever they were, they had been here, inside the house, before Mrs. Henderson or Mr. Hawkes had locked the doors for the night, and had fled through the front door in the confusion of Will's fall. Trembling, Will hastily locked the doors again, leaving no sign of an intruder to alarm the servants. He knew there were any number of ways to gain access to a house this size during the day, and it worried him. Had it not been Hannibal's paramour, waltzed in on his arm in the dead of night, then it was someone with wicked intentions and no business being here. The Duke's suite was here on the main floor. He would make a rather tempting target, Will knew, if he himself was not the intended victim. Shaking off the feeling of hands shoving him, Will carried his little lamp downstairs to the darkened kitchen, and made himself a small breakfast of dry bread and cold tea to accompany more of the headache powder Mrs. Pym's kept in the cupboard. He sat alone at the servants' table in the meagre light, with oppressive darkness looming all around him, all thoughts turning to Hannibal. He had applied himself to Hannibal's perspective since that day his Omega nature had latched on to the man as the ruling and most dangerous alpha to be pleased. It had been less of a struggle to suppress his point of view these last 6 years, but with Hannibal so close, so constantly, it was all too easy for Will to see what would suit him best. Unfortunately, that was himself dead, and removed from his problematic position if all other methods failed. After all this time, he was surely impatient to move on with his life, and Will was nothing more than an obstacle to be overcome. There was no consideration for his feelings or understanding that he even had them. There was no concern for him in the least. He was in the way, and all this talk of accepting him and giving him a child was simply a means to get close enough to easily push Will off the nearest cliff. It was frighteningly, perfectly reasonable.
"Mr. Graham, goodness, you're up early considering," Mrs. Pym's declared, up and dressed and ready to start the morning meal for the servants, who would soon rise. "You should have rang for me."
"It's perfectly fine, Mrs. Pym's," he said, rising slowly to leave his barely eaten bread on the table. "I couldn't sleep. I'm sorry for invading your kitchen yet again."
"Invading," she laughed, sweeping the plate away. "Mr. Graham, after the night you've had to do a little sleeplessness, and you're always welcome in your own kitchen by rights."
"You heard?" Will asked, barely above a mute whisper.
"Mr. Hawkes informed us,"
she said over the sounds of the house awakening, servants milling, boots clicking on wooden floors, voices raised in whispered conversation as they began to file downstairs.
"Everyone woke at the hubbub, and you know how he hates gossip."
"Mrs. Pym's, Mr. Graham, this is unexpected,"
Mr. Hawkes said, drawing up to a halt with a spill of maids coursing around him like water around a stone.
"Are you unwell, Mr. Graham? Should I fetch Lord Clarges?"
"No, Mr. Hawkes, that won't be necessary," Will assured him, making room for Mrs. Pym's assistance as they started their morning chores. "But I would like to ask if you could be vigilant for new faces coming in below stairs."
"New faces, Mr. Graham?"
he echoed, a frown falling over his sombre face.
"Lady Rathmore arrived with only her lady's maid, Miss Speck, I believe, and of course Mr. Dollaride."
"I have an uneasy feeling, Mr. Hawkes, that there have been individuals in Hertford House who have no true business here," Will said, feeling increasingly like a madman as he spoke, a sentiment Mr. Hawkes was too dignified to allow show on his face.
"I will, of course, inform the staff to be alert,"
Mr. Hawkes said, indulging his requests as he must. "Thank you, Mr. Hawkes," Will said, and made the laborious return trip upstairs where he supposedly belonged, wondering how on earth he could protect himself against an alpha who saw him as nothing more than a weed to be plucked out by the root. It was that thought that decided him, that brought him to his little desk in his suite to write to his father's solicitor, Mr. Browner. In short, concise sentences, he explained everything that had happened and instructed Mr. Browner to gather an accounting of his assets and all material worth. He wrote that they be given to Mina, should anything happen to him, and that she should use those funds to discover the truth of what might have happened to him. I'm in a very precarious position. I rely on your silence in this case, Mr. Browner. No one in my family should be bothered by this unless I come to an untimely and suspicious end. Will's hand shook as he folded it into an envelope and sealed it against inquiry. It relieved him somewhat to have someone else in possession of what he had learned. Should anything happen to him, at least Mina would be able to find out the truth of it. He took the letter downstairs, panting softly against rising nausea, and headed directly for the door, starting like he'd been caught stealing when Mr. Hawkes politely inquired from behind him. "May I take that for you, Mr. Graham?" "No." Will clutched the letter to his chest protectively, embarrassed by the clear concern he saw in Mr. Hawkes's face at his strange behavior. He felt heat in his cheeks and sweat break out on his brow, enough that Mr. Hawkes's somber face fell into lines of concern. He cleared his throat and said with practised calm, "No, thank you, Mr. Hawkes. I thought I might ride down to town and post it myself." "You do not look at all well, Mr. Graham. It would be less trouble for you if I send a footman—" "No, Mr. Hawkes, thank you," Will said, his smile tight and tense as he tucked the letter out of reach. "I will take it myself. I'm rather at loose ends now that I've been removed from my position."
"You have not been removed from your position," Hannibal said, his deep voice sounding suddenly as he came downstairs. "You are assuming your proper position, Will. And rightly so, my lord," Mr. Hawkes confirmed, nodding sagely, extraordinarily pleased. Hannibal moved toward him, fluidly graceful and strong, and the tug Will felt towards him from their bond brought an answering flood of fear, and something else that felt frightening like the stirrings of his heat, though it was far too early by Will's counting. Hannibal cocked his head, sensing it, his deep frown pulling on Will like a hook in a trout, bringing a fresh flush to his cheeks. "You're up very early," Will said, forcing himself to ignore the persistent dull throb in his head, the worsening ache spreading through his body from his fall. "The military makes one an early riser," Hannibal said, his concern growing as he looked at Will. "I thought I might go for my ride. On any other day I would ask if you cared to join me. You really don't look well, Will. Not surprising, all things considered. I do wish you would permit me to examine you, Will. I am certain you are not as hale as you believe you are."
"My apologies, Lord Clarges. I was heading to town," Will said, wincing when the throbbing in his head took umbrage at his speaking, the pounding of it holding pace with his quickening heartbeat. Hannibal noted how pale he seemed, and told him,
"Will, I truly advise against it. You took quite a fall last night, and I don't think you should be riding."
"I'm fine," Will said, desperate to finish his task. "It is only to the village and back, not clear across the country."
"Then I shall ride with you,"
Hannibal decided, Will's reaction to his injuries lifting an irresistible urge to care for him, watch over him, keep him safe from harm. Hannibal didn't know if the instinct was due to his being an alpha or a physician, but he honestly didn't care. His mate was hurting, perhaps even injured, and he needed to be near in case Will needed him.
"I will not stand for you tumbling from your mare and injuring yourself further, nor do I want you to be found unconscious on the roadside."
"No doubt if I were, those who found me would consider it merely an Omega's foolishness and deliver me back to my proper owner," Will said, bitter with the harsh truth of his life. "Mr. Hawkes, please have Mr. Dollaride meet me out front. He can accompany me to town in case my weakness overcomes me."
"Hawkes, you will do nothing of the sort," Hannibal immediately countered, informing Will. "I am not allowing a man I have no knowledge of, let alone another alpha, escort my spouse into town. There has been quite enough gossip regarding this family, as I have become painfully and thoroughly aware. The only thing that is overcoming you right now is that crack to your head, Will. Weakness plays no part in it."
Glowering at Hannibal, Will made for the front door hastily enough that Mr. Hawkes was not in time to sweep it open for him. The world quivered dangerously at the edges of his vision, but Will put one foot in front of the other with stiff-backed determination, heading straight for the stables.
Will, I know for a fact that you aren't feeling well if you're confounding the staff.
Hannibal's voice followed him out into the brightening morning. His long-legged stride caught up to Will in moments.
Hawk's nearly had an apoplexy at the sight of you getting the door yourself. He thinks you very abused, having had to do so.
He needn't concern himself to such an extent, Will assured him, brushing past the startled stable lads and Hertford House's diffident groom to reach his mare's box. Her ears were perked, already swiveled to the sound of his voice, and her bright, eager eyes eased his upset somewhat. "I have been put to much harder use than opening a door."
"Peter,"
Hannibal said, noting he looked torn between wanting to interfere and wanting to escape.
"Please fetch your lordship's gear, that he may not be abused on that count, and mind that you check it. I want no more accidents befalling my spouse."
Will bristled, but did not naysay him. Impressed that he held his tongue, Hannibal said,
"Thank you for not arguing."
"Peter is very sensitive to unpleasantness, as well you should know," Will said, slipping into the mare's box to lean against her neck and hide his face, already exhausted but not about to admit that he was feeling dizzy, and very much doubted his own ability to saddle his mare in his worsening state. "Contradicting you would only have upset him."
"Such a thoughtful master you are," Hannibal mused, frowning.
Will still carried the scent of fear, but it was overridden by his pain. Hannibal could feel his awareness of it growing, plucking at his nerves. Frowning, he patted his stallion's nose, reaching out for its outstretched muzzle, and avoiding its nibbling teeth from force of long habit. "I am not a master here, Hannibal. I never have been," Will said, glad to have his mare's solid, sturdy body between him and the man he simply could not trust. "I am merely a placeholder."
"Will, you are married to a man who will eventually hold a very precious title. You are no placeholder."
"That is not what your social circle believes," Will said, pressing his forehead to the mare's warm neck, careful of the lump that had grown larger in the hours since his fall. "Nor what you have admitted. I am not welcome or wanted or needed here. I have only been a troublesome guest for 6 years. The staff have been kind enough to take care of me."
"Take care of you? They have hardly seen you,"
Hannibal said, preparing to address the subject of Will's fall last night, and, perhaps, open the way to telling him about Melinda. Before he could imagine a graceful way to do so, however, Peter and the stable boys returned with their gear. Will took his chance to escape the uncomfortable conversation by allowing Peter to saddle his mare while he himself retreated to the yard, using any excuse not to look at his husband. He grew cold thinking about how provoking he had been, his frustration and the after-effects of his fall pushing him past the bounds of common sense. It was not wise, he knew, to needle a man who wished to kill him. Peter finished quickly and led the mare out into the growing sunlight, holding her bridle and soothing her when Will tried to mount. He could barely get his foot into the stirrup for the hurt it caused, and swallowed back a harsh cry at the scream of refusal from his back when he tried to pull up. Peter, worried and uncertain, ended up boosting him into the saddle, casting anxious looks back at the stable, as if willing Hannibal to emerge and put a halt to it. Will settled in his saddle, and for a chilling moment he was sure he would slide from the mare's back onto his face. The world tipped and swayed, and his head hurt from the top of his skull in a flare of fire all the way down to his pelvis. It took every bit of his formidable willpower to remain upright. It was the sound of Hannibal's voice that prompted him to move, despite his injuries. Without waiting to consider the consequences, Will urged the mare onto the lane and gave her her head, the chill morning air cooling his flushed cheeks and mitigating the nausea that his mare's movements caused. There was a thunder of hoofbeats behind him, then a glance over his shoulder showed him Hannibal bent over the stallion's neck, crop flat to his side, urging the horse to stretch its long legs. It sent a deep jolt of terror through him, and Will's mare nickered, responding by stretching her own gait. Will leaned over her neck and held on for dear life, his usual ease abandoning him to stiffness and ache, leaving him clinging to her back. He prayed he wouldn't be sick down her neck. He prayed he wouldn't fall off of her, and he prayed that Hannibal wouldn't run him down on the lane where no witnesses could see what might befall him. His mare picked up on his anxiety and picked up her pace, straining into a full-blown run. She was shorter than Hannibal's horse, and didn't have as much speed in a sprint, but she easily outdistanced the high-spirited stallion's short-lived burst of speed, only losing her lead when they hit the outskirts of Hertford town. She slowed, unused to such concentrated effort, and Will cautiously pushed himself upright, hoping he was safe enough within the town's waking eyes to see them. He patted her damp neck with appreciation, releasing a shaky breath of relief when the cool air soothed his heated skin, and the nausea that seemed to worsen with each beat of his heart. The world began to glimmer around the edges, wavering and indistinct, threatening him with dizziness he could ill afford while trying to keep his seat. Hannibal overshot him, slowed and circled back, flushed with the cool air, the very picture of viral alpha good health. He seemed in tolerable spirits, Will irritably noted. But then, he had every reason to be, considering how close he'd come to killing Will last night. It was dangerous to be alone with him, mortally dangerous, and Will had the lump on his skull to prove it.
"You shouldn't have ridden so recklessly, Will,"
Hannibal said, concern overcoming him, his stallion's hide steaming in the cool air.
"What if you had fallen unconscious? You might have been killed."
"I am unfortunately resilient," Will said, giving him wide berth to continue into town, almost unable to keep his seat, "as my various accidents and my father can attest."
"Your father?"
Hannibal asked, the oddness of including a man Will rarely, if ever, spoke of, overridden by his worry, when Will listed sharply and only just caught himself.
"Were you prone to accidents as a child?"
Will hesitated, breathing shallow. When Hannibal's stare sharpened, he merely said, "Yes."
"Strange,"
Hannibal said, treading lightly in his attempts to engage him, as Will was in pain and nervous of him, that same fear from last night rearing its ugly head.
"You've never once displayed a lack of grace, Will, yet you say you are accident-prone, and only just fell down our stairs and nearly broke your neck."
"I am sorry to have deceived you yet again, Lord Clarges, but I am exceptionally clumsy," Will said, taking a ragged breath and swallowing against the urge to be sick. "My father is a saint for his patience with me."
"I had imagined he held you quite dear,"
Hannibal said, falling in next to him as they rode towards the awakening town, alert in case Will did slide from his saddle.
"The only son in a family of females?"
Will skated a sideways glance at him, swaying more from his dizziness than his mare's gait. The ache in his head and down his back made him short in his answers, and his voice was sharp when he said, "I was never the son he deserved, Lord Clarges."
"Still, I cannot imagine he was very pleased with your reception here, or the fact that you took over as land agent,"
Hannibal said, unabashedly fishing for information on the man who had refused correspondence from his newly married son. He angled more than one worried glance at Will, concerned by his obvious discomfort and distress. The doctor in him wanted to put a stop to this nonsensical ride this instant, but the newly informed alpha in him hesitated to do so. "To the contrary, I am sure he was quite pleased. It is his philosophy that useless things are only fit for burning," Will said, closing his blue eyes down to slits as the sun intruded to further agitate his stomach. "Father insisted I apply myself to learning the intricacies of running an estate."
"He imagined he would one day leave his own in your charge?"
Hannibal inquired, imagining how besotted Will's father must have been with him if he thought to challenge inheritance laws which treated Omegas the same as women. But it made little sense when compared to what Hawks had said about the Earl being unpleasant to Will. Whatever the case may be, he clearly had not raised Will with any great affection, though Hannibal could not imagine why on earth he had restrained himself from doing so. "Heavens, no," Will said, huffing a soft, scornful laugh to spite himself, moving his mare away from Hannibal's mount, keeping enough distance between them to stay out of reach. His circumstances drove him to impulsively say, "No, Lord Clarges." He knew I had no prospects for marriage, and would need a livelihood if I did not wish to starve on the street. Hannibal was slightly taken aback by that statement, sure he had not heard correctly.
"Why would your father think you had no prospects?"
"I was unfortunately born both unattractive and Omegan," Will said without rancor, and a sharp glance showed Hannibal he was not uncharacteristically fishing for compliments. "After 7 sisters, there was no money left to promise a dowry that could adequately compensate for the burden of my care. The best I could hope for was to earn my living. He was never hopeful that I would manage to attract a mate or have a family, but he did the best he could for me under the circumstances, which was to see to my education."
"That is entirely perplexing,"
Hannibal murmured, decidedly aware that Will was anything but plain or unattractive, and wondering how his father had managed to convince him it was so, or why he would even bother doing so. He nudged his horse slightly closer to Will's mare when his mate slumped in his saddle, wincing. He hesitated, wanting nothing more than to ease him down from his mare and examine him, but in Will's current state of hurt and agitation, he knew he only risked being cautioned for his concern. He settled instead for speaking, keeping Will focused on staying upright, and said,
"I had always imagined you spent your days at your father's side, being coddled and doted upon."
"You mistake me for one of my sisters," Will softly said, a sad frown bowing his mouth when he thought of his father and how dearly he loved his many daughters. Figuring his husband would praise his father's dogma, he swallowed back for his growing sickness and said, "Coddling is dangerous for Omegas. It encourages weakness and dependence. It terrified him to think I would be enslaved by my biology. He used strong measures to ensure I would not be."
"Well,"
Hannibal said, digesting what he'd been told, his measure of Will's father finding sharp new corners that cut a much different picture than he'd always held. Yet he could not tell Will's feelings for his father. His husband seemed defensive of his father, spouting rhetoric that Hannibal saw the ugly shadow of himself within. Hoping not to offend Will any more than he already had, he could only offer,
"He must love you very much to take such pains on your behalf."
"Pain is the very cornerstone of his love for me," Will said, the words bitter and harsh, dislodged from him in an excess of physical discomfort despite the presence of Hannibal so near him. "I was not always sure that I would survive it." There was a sobering seriousness in the way Will spoke that gave him gooseflesh, that made him wonder just what relationship Will had with his father that would make him honestly think that he might not survive it.
"Your father is a gentleman,"
Hannibal said, swallowing hard to force down the strengthening sense of unease Will had given him. He looked at his spouse, who seemed in that moment terribly fragile and terribly damaged there in the early morning sunlight, pale and clearly ill, his tired blue eyes ringed in dark circles, the lump on his head purple-red and angry.
"Will,"
he said, drawing his stallion to a stop, Will's mare pausing alongside him.
"I cannot dance around this subject one moment longer, and I cannot hope to guess your feelings in this matter. Will, tell me plainly, was he unkind to you?"
Will looked over at him, blue eyes moiling with misery and a deep, profound distress for a moment before they glazed over, giving Hannibal nothing more than the reflection of his own stern face. "He was the only alpha to care for me," Will stated, his voice faint and resigned and filled with a deadly kind of calm that Hannibal knew all too well from the battlefield and that chilled him to his soul. "He would not have been unkind or cruel for no reason."
"Therefore the obvious answer is that you gave him reason?"
Hannibal asked, rapidly coming to the conclusion that he immensely disliked Will's father, if only because of the way Will reacted at the mere mention of him. "I suppose I must have," Will said, relieved that they had stopped moving, though the world still swayed dangerously, and he had tiny little spots dancing at the edges of his vision that in no way aided his equilibrium. He sat half-hunched in his saddle, burning with heat, and regretting his rash decision to deliver the letter himself. There was every possibility that he would end up in the ditch by the side of the road, perhaps not even due to Hannibal putting him there.
"Will, I am not your father,"
Hannibal said, realizing that his spouse's family dynamic had not been at all what he'd once imagined, and that he may never have the truth of it.
"Not all alphas are the same."
Will stared at him for a long, silent moment, long enough that Hannibal cautiously asked,
What is it?"
"Not all alphas are the same." He offered a mirthless laugh, the statement so absurd under the circumstances that he couldn't restrain himself, despite his survival sense warning him to tread with caution. "Yet all Omegas are. I wonder how that could be." "Will, I have known my father, and I have known you, Hannibal. Suffice to say, the majority of my experience is that you are the same, in the most dangerous of ways." Hannibal paled, uncomfortable to be categorized by Will in the same company as the man who so clearly had mistreated him. "I find myself curious, Lord Claudius, how you will treat the child you insist I give you," Will said, eyes open only enough to fix on Hannibal, picking him apart and finding him lacking. "Beaten for the smallest infraction? Gagged for laughing, perhaps? Would you break your son's fingers for touching things he should not?" "Of course not. What an appalling thing to say, Will. No one in their right mind would treat a child in such a way. Why would you even think of such things?" "Did he do such to you, Will?" "It isn't my place to say. Blame it on my imagination, Hannibal," Will said, looking away so that Hannibal would not read the illness and wretched sadness that was rapidly overcoming him. He felt out of resources, at the end of his strength and wits, vulnerable and friendless, and with so little left to lose that he wondered why he'd even bothered to protect it. "It is, I've been told, my greatest fault."
"Honestly, who would speak of such horrors?"
Hannibal breathed, grimacing at the images Will's words had conjured. He could feel agitation vibrating from his mate, a physical pain that made his teeth clench against the force of it. Vastly disturbed, he said,
"You can very safely assume I would never do any of those things, if it even needs to be said. An elector heir will know a life of contentment, I assure you. A proper son is the point to all of this, after all."
"A proper son," Will echoed, laughing again, harsh and unhappy and grim.
"Yes,"
Hannibal said, wondering at his emphasis, at his strange behavior, and a fearful something from Will he could sense that felt too close to despair.
"That is what the two of us are required to provide my family, after all. I do not need another daughter. One is quite enough."
"You speak of children so easily," Will said, disturbed to an unsettling degree and driven to fearless imprudence with the force of his hurt. "Pretending that your forced attempts to know me for your grandfather's sake are in pursuit of an heir, when we both know very well what you truly intend."
"Will, what do you think I intend?"
Hannibal asked, noting how visibly upset Will was, so tense, in fact, that his mare began to sidestep, which irritated his own mount.
"Will, if you mean my goading about bringing my daughter here, let me assure you that I have absolutely no intentions of doing something so callous."
Will's mare tossed her head, and Will nearly lost his seat, and that decided Hannibal, who said with that alpha throb in his voice,
"You are being foolish, Will, and I am putting a stop to this right now. You're coming down from there if I have to drag you kicking and screaming, which I am sure you are still up for despite your terrible state."
"Don't you dare!" Will warned him, clinging to the saddle, his breath hitching when the mare skittered to one side of the lane.
"I have no idea what on earth has gotten into you, but it is high time that we settled this."
Hannibal moved to reach Will, who jerked the mare's reins with uncharacteristic roughness, causing her to rapidly turn, the words "settle this" echoing in his mind.
"Will, for God's sakes, have a care!"
Will leaned over the mare's neck, the motion causing him to teeter on the cusp of actual sickness. He sensed Hannibal coming closer, and snarled, "Stay away from me!" Startled, Hannibal hesitated, Will's jittery fear and obvious hurt like a punch in his gut. Despite the warning, he couldn't help but try to get closer, concerned his mate might slide from the mare's back to the ground. The sturdy little horse protested Will's treatment of her, unused to such handling, and broke into a trot back toward Hertford House and the soothing affection she knew waited for her there. Will scrambled to sit upright, the world spinning and his heart thundering. He was terrified he would fall again, terrified that Hannibal would keep questioning him, would force him down and throttle him right there on the lane, and settle things after all.
"Will!"
Hannibal shouted, deftly turning his mount in pursuit of Will, rushing to reach him before he could fall as he had before. He overtook him and managed to grasp the mare's bridle, slowing them both to a stop.
"Will, what in the 7 hells is going through your mind right now? You could have been killed."
"Isn't that what you're after?"
"What I'm after, Will."
Will listed to one side, and Hannibal caught his arm to steady him. "Don't you dare touch me!" Will snarled, eyes wide, fear rolling off him in metallic waves. The scent and taste of it hit Hannibal with the force of a cannonball, overriding him with an instinctive, aggressive need to shield Will from what threatened him. The sudden shift in his mate was so abrupt that Hannibal was momentarily breathless with it. Before he could even react to the change, Will's other hand whipped around, his crop snapping across Hannibal's cheek in a white-hot flare of pain. Hannibal jerked back, mingled shock and hurt, hand lifting to touch his cheek where blood was already beginning to well from the cut, his stallion sidestepping and loosing an unhappy whinny. Will panted, cheeks flushed, eyes showing whites all around as if he was consumed with absolute terror. As much as Hannibal wanted to question him in that moment, the very depth of Will's fear made him realize something was very, very wrong.
Will, don't touch me!
Will hissed again, the horse dancing beneath him in agitation.
You are not my alpha!
Will, he said again, calling out as the young man rode off like the devil himself was after him, trailing the scent of terror and a strange, warm sweetness much stronger than his usual faint, sugary scent.